You're listening to the Corbett Report.
Welcome back, friends. Welcome back to another edition of the Corbett Report. I'm James Corbett of CorbettReport.com, coming to you as always from the sunny climes of Western Japan, here in April of 2025 with episode 474 of the Corbett Report podcast, The History of the Kazoo. Yes, we are going to continue our exploration of the history of various musical instruments today with a detailed history of the kazoo. And it just so happens that my new assistant, Sean, happens to be an authoritative historian expert on the history of the kazoo. Say hi, Sean.
Hello.
Excellent. So today we're going to be talking about the roots of this instrument, going back to the 16th century simple membrane instruments like the onion flute. But, of course, it was Alabama Vest in Macon, Georgia, back in the 1840s that... Hold on a second. Hold on. I am getting a notification. Apparently, there is a story worth our time and attention that is just dropping. Let me take a look live on air here. Declassification of records concerning the assassinations of President John F. Kennedy, Senator Robert F. Kennedy, and the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Wow, a new executive order dropped from the Trump White House just a couple of months ago, and it says, long story short, within 15 days of the date of this order, the Director of National Intelligence and the Attorney General shall, in coordination with the Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs and the Counsel to the President, present a plan to the President for the full and complete release of records relating to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Oh my God, it's happening, folks. The JFK files have dropped, in case you haven't seen it. And yes, this has been updated to show the actual link to the JFK files on whitehouse.gov. And that will take you to this page where it will take approximately forever to load these apparently three-part downloads. Yeah, all of these 2,600 plus documents are apparently in these 3 downloads. I've been loading it for the past, 15, 20 minutes, and it's still loading. So I'll let you know what I ultimately end up getting here. The only thing I know for sure is that this website contains the strangest, stupidest, most useless, but slightly, for some reason, most entertaining feature I've ever seen on a website before. I can sort of highlight text with my cursor just by moving on. I don't know what on earth that is. Thank you to Elon Musk for doing that for all of us. That has really provided a service to humanity. Anyway, the JFK files are loading here on whitehouse.gov, but you don't have to wait for them to load. You can go and explore them yourself at the National Archives, archives.gov. Excuse me. The link, of course, will be in the show notes for those who haven't checked it out yet. But long story short, in accordance with President Donald Trump's directive of March 17th, 2025, all records previously withheld for classification that are part of the President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection are released. And scrolling down, oh, here they are. Excellent. So we've got some documents here. So if we just start clicking on them, we'll find a routing and record sheet from 1964. And it's not immediately clear where this source is from, but it's definitely marked secret. It's CI staff, Birch O'Neill, room 2B63, talking about a article in the Italian Communist Party weekly Rinascita about the assassination that apparently implicates the agency in the murder of President Kennedy. So I'm going to gather this is from the CIA, and they're talking about some... Well, they're really just... this is about an attached article that isn't even attached. So it's really just the routing and record sheet that has apparently been classified and kept from your attention for the past 60-plus years. For what particular reason? Who knows? Let's keep going. What's the next record? Discussion between member senior division concerning Oswald's stay in Helsinki. And here we have another routing and record sheet with some phone numbers and stuff on it. And then memo for the record. And it's talking about Oswald's stay in Finland in October 1959. And, okay, it's just basically talking about that subject. And it's just a few sentences long. All right. Not exactly the smoking gun of the JFK assassination that you might expect from documents that have been kept from your attention for 60 plus years, but let's keep on marching through. What's the next one? Oh, it's basically what we just looked at, but it's the actual typed version of that. However, it's clearly a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy that at this point is almost unreadable. But again, okay, well, it was released for FOIA review in 1976, but here we are getting it for the first time ever in March of 2025. All right, cool. What is going on here? Well, anyway, these record numbers are utterly and completely meaningless and indecipherable and tell you absolutely nothing about whatever it is you're going to be clicking on. 104-10003-10041.pdf. Oh, of course. That's going to be a routing and record sheet that's going to tell us about some Communist Party weekly Italian article that's there someone's sending to someone else in the agency, right? No, of course not. It's completely indecipherable and meaningless. But at least there's only 10 records to go. Oh, wait. This is 1 to 10 of 2,566 documents. Well, at least you can go all. Let's not go that ambitious. Let's go 200 at a time. Oh, okay. So now you can start clicking through one by one by one by one and going through hundreds and hundreds, no, thousands of documents individually that, again, have been classified for 60 plus years. Let's just click on one randomly. What on earth is this? Beckman Gunnar, 3607 James Bridge Road, Chevy Chase, Maryland. Okay. Bagley Tennant, 56 blah, blah, blah. Angleton, James T. Oh, well, I know that. Oh, James J, of course. Not Jesus, Jesus. Anyway, you know James Angleton, right? Okay, all right. A lot of names, numbers. Ooh, Tokyo. All right. Just scrawled names and addresses and numbers. And that goes on for page after page after page. Well, somebody's address book here. Whose? In what context? What does this mean? Why is this here? What does this tell us? Who knows? No context. That's the file that we're looking at. So what we have here is, yes, the release of all of these documents finally at long last. And if you want, I invite you, be my guest and go and start clicking through one by one by one, all 2,600 plus of these documents, and tell me what you find. I will be interested to hear about it, as long as it's interesting. At any rate, the link to this will obviously be in the show notes for today's episode, so you can go and start exploring it for yourself. But what on earth is this? What are these records? Where did they come from? What is contained in here that is actually worth our attention? Why have these things been classified for 60 plus years? Good questions. Let's find out. Yes, I think I'll make an audible on this one. We're not going to go the history of the kazoo for episode 474. No, this is episode 474 of the Corbett Report podcast, What I Learned from the JFK Files. So, I think we have to start setting the table by at least finding out where this story of this declassification of these files that date back usually to the 1960s themselves. They're files from the 1970s, etc. Where did this ball start rolling? How did this process start? Why is Trump suddenly releasing this stuff? What does this mean? In order to understand that, we're going to have to start in a perhaps surprising place. No, we're not going to look at, say, Dallas, Texas in 1963. We're not going to look even at the archives in Washington. No, this story starts in an altogether unexpected place. It starts in Hollywood in 1991.
If I answer that question you keep asking, if I give you the name of the big enchilada, you know, then it's Bon Voyage Dino.
No cloak and dagger stuff, you know. They call it Operation Mongoose.
Think the unthinkable. Question everything. Now we're through the looking glass here, people. White is black, and black is white.
People got to know. People got to know why he was killed.
You're close. You're closer than you think.
I say let justice be done, though the heavens fall.
That's right. The story of this JFK Records release does not date back to the 1960s. It has nothing to do with Dallas or Washington. No, it has to do with Hollywood myth-making. In particular, of course, the 1991 JFK by Oliver Stone, which, you may or may not remember, had a title card at the end asserting that a congressional investigation from 1976 to 1979 found a probable conspiracy in the assassination of John F. Kennedy and recommended the Justice Department investigate further. As of 1991, i.e. the release of JFK, the Justice Department has done nothing. The files of the House Select Committee on Assassinations are locked away until the year 2029. 2029? Oh my God, it'll be a Jetsons future by that point, surely. So that particular piece of information at the end of JFK apparently shocked the public enough to actually get people really interested in the subject again. And say what you will about Hollywood predictive programming and myth-making, and I will have more to say about particularly the producer of this film that you may or may not know about later on in today's episode. But again, whatever you think about that film, it certainly did cause a resurge in interest in the topic and did actually ultimately prompt a series of congressional hearings that resulted in new legislation, the JFK Records Act of 1992. And it was in the deliberations over that act that we saw, for example, the congressional testimony of a number of people on the subject, including director Oliver Stone himself.
Perhaps, Mr. Chairman, the files which are the object of House Joint Resolution 454 will yield some or all of these answers. Perhaps not. But without this resolution, we shall never know. And in a free society, that is intolerable. The stone wall must come down. Now, I am aware, Mr. Chairman, the resolution will be criticized. Legal hair-splitting by the Department of Justice and the Office of Management and Budget, part of arcane battles which really concern the propriety of the special prosecutor rules, may impede passage. The actual language of the resolution may have been drafted as too complex, but none of those objections can have a lot of weight with those millions of Americans, 15, 17 million Americans, who saw JFK in movie theaters, and millions more, maybe another 20 or 30 million, who will see it at home on video cassette and on television. Nearly all of whom are determined 50 years shall not pass before we can pierce the media's silence and learn the truth for ourselves. The people have spoken loudly and clearly. The agencies who have stonewalled for decades may invoke that catchphrase of obstructionists and hiders of the truth, the magic words, national security. But, Mr. Chairman, our enemy lies in ruins, and the danger some Soviet agent may learn something embarrassing to the CIA or naval intelligence is no longer important, if it ever was. It is only important to those who may be hiding something.
And that's the point, isn't it? Yes. Why on earth would these documents have been kept under secrecy for so long unless they were hiding something? So, that got the ball rolling, and as I say, that started the process. That testimony led to the JFK Records Act of 1992, which formed something called the Assassination Records Review Board, the ARRB, whose task it was to go as an independent agency to go around and to gather any related documents and records from various agencies in the U.S. government, including the FBI and the CIA and other agencies besides, and to take that information, collect it all at the National Archives, and at that point, to eventually release them to the public. There was a stipulation in the JFK Records Act itself that within 25 years of the passage of that act on October 26, 1992, that all documents should be released unless there was specific exemption for them. And, well, we'll get to that part of the story later. But as I say, you can go and read the actual final report of the ARRB that was issued in 1998 and was signed off on by the various chairs and people who were associated with this. And they make an interesting point. Speaking of calling things by their right name, they make an interesting point in the preface here. The board's first task was to define the term assassination record in order to frame the search for relevant records. Yeah, that kind of makes a difference. What is a relevant assassination record? There are lots of things that have to do with lots of the moving pieces of this puzzle. Does that relate to the assassination? Maybe, I guess. Well, okay. Hopefully, one would think they erred on the side of declassification rather than continuing to hold things in. But of course, you couldn't take every document from every agency that was produced in, the 10 years leading up to the assassination and the 10 years after? There has to be some sort of way that they could go through this. So there were diligent researchers in the ARRB that did their level best to get those documents out. And one of those documents that I know that my regular audience will be familiar with is literally the Operation Northwoods documents. You have seen these because I have talked about them and shown them to you many times in the past. But this particular release, this actual document detailing the plan for Operation Northwoods, signed off by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, sitting there on Kennedy's desk in March of '62, that document comes from the ARRB. It was part of the documents that they were releasing. Is this an assassination document? Well, is it related? Is it an assassination record? Well, anyway, it was released as part of the ARRB's work, and it's certainly relevant to what was happening in the Kennedy administration in the lead up to the assassination. And for people who don't know about that, of course, they can see my presentation to Lancer last year on JFK and Gladio. There's a lot to dig into in that particular puzzle. But anyway, that's just one example of the many, many, many documents that were released as part of the ARRB's work. But the ARRB officially wrapped up its work in 1998, but that wasn't the end of the releases. And you can get some sense of that from the Wikipedia article. I know. Before you start typing your angry response, I can't believe a Wikipedia article. This isn't about important information. This is just to show the timeline of events here. But yes, the President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act of 1992, aka the JFK Records Act, was passed in October of 1992. And it does talk about its genesis in the JFK film and the public uproar at that time, etc., etc. But more to the point, it talks about the various releases that have happened after the 1998 finishing up of the ARRB's work. Because, again, the ARRB collected thousands and thousands and thousands of documents, some of which were released immediately, some of which were released at various times over the intervening decades, depending on national security or, this person's still alive, so we have to withhold this document, and et cetera, et cetera. But there have been other releases along the way. So, for example, in its overview here, it says, prior to October 2017, over 35,000 documents were still not fully available, i.e. partially redacted, to the public. And among them, 3,603 were at that time unseen by the public. So there were a lot of records that had been released in redacted form that were supposed to be completely unredacted by October 2017, that is to say 25 years after the passage of the Act. But there were still 3,600 plus that were unseen in any form prior to that point. So in 2017, as the deadline was approaching, the National Archives began to release the remaining documents previously held. So you might remember I did talk about that at the time a little bit. There were some documents that came out at that time. But Trump did not release all the documents. Apparently some national security stooges whispered in his ear, and he decided to withhold several thousand more documents. So in 2018, the National Archive released another 19,000 documents, and then there was still more left to be released. So that was postponed until 2021, and then, the scamdemic, we can't possibly do it in 2021, so they set a December 2022 date, in which we got an additional 13,000 documents, and then June 2023, 99% of all the documents were made public by that point, according to the New York Times. But 4,684 were still fully or partially withheld. Okay, and then finally we get this January 2025 executive order, declassification of records, blah, blah, blah. And as a result of that, we get this glorious JFK files release. And this is what this is. This is where it comes from. It comes from that process that got rolling in 1992, and here we are finally in 2025, 4 years ahead of that schedule that Oliver Stone was bemoaning at the end of JFK. You remember? Oh, those records are going to be held till 2029. Well, here it is, 2025, and we have most of them, but still not all, actually. We'll get more into that eventually. But here they are, the JFK files, and yes, it looks like basically this has given up even attempting to load in the page here, although obviously the highlighter still works. And I did download the document, and yes, it is a almost 2 gigabyte file. Each part is almost 2 gigabytes. It's 35,000 pages per file plus, and it won't even load properly. It's actually giving all sorts of errors and things and taking hours to load. So probably the better way to go through these would be to go through the National Archives post. But having said that, again, there are literally thousands of PDFs completely unnamed. You just have to click on them and find out what's in them. And then, if you find a good one, you better make a note of where you found it, I guess. What an efficient system. It's almost like they still have something to hide. Well, of course they do still have things to hide, and that is going to be the subject of today's exploration. Now, I'm not clickbaiting. There's no teasing going on here. Let me put it up front. No, I have not seen the smoking gun document in here that changes everything. Oh my God. You will never believe this document I found. It may exist in here, but I haven't seen it yet, and I haven't heard it reported on yet. I have heard some interesting reports of various facts and things that have been put together as a result of this, and that's what we're going to be exploring today. But I just want to put that up front. If you're looking for the smoking gun, oh my God, here is exactly how it happened. You are not going to find that. You can stop listening to this podcast right now and go on with your day. For the rest of you who are interested in what actually is and is not in these files, well, that's what we're here to explore. So I wanted to start today by talking to someone who has been looking at this issue of the classification problem of the JFK records and what they contain and what they don't contain for many, many years, and someone who has done his own research into the JFK assassination file, including writing 2 books on the subject, one of which was specifically about the autopsy itself, and one of which was a more general question about regime change operations. I'm talking about Jacob Hornberger, who I hope will be familiar to my audience as the founder of the Future of Freedom Foundation at fff.org. And you should be familiar with him, as I say, because he has been a previous guest on the Corbett Report. But perhaps you're familiar with his JFK research. For example, his book Regime Change, The JFK Assassination, or his book The Kennedy Autopsy. And I had the privilege of talking to Jacob Hornberger on the occasion of the release of these files. Not about the files in particular, or particular files, but about the genesis of these files, the story of where they came from, and what they may or may not contain. So let's listen to a section of that interview where I started by asking him about the Assassination Records Review Board and the work that it did.
Well, you're right about JFK. Oliver Stone had included a little blurb at the end of the movie saying they're still keeping their assassination-related records secret. The whole national security establishment, the Secret Service, the Pentagon, the CIA, other federal agencies. And this is in 91, so this is 30 years after the assassination. Well, people went ballistic, and it was a classic case of where public pressure forced Congress to act. So Congress passes the JFK Records Act that mandates all federal agencies to disclose, reveal, publish all of their assassination-related records. No more secrecy here. That was the mandate. And so to enforce this mandate, they brought into existence the Assassination Records Review Board, which was a semi-independent agency. It fell under the auspices of the president, but they were operating independently. Now, one of the fascinating aspects of this law is that somebody slipped a provision into the law that prohibited the ARRB from reinvestigating any aspect of the Kennedy assassination. And that's really bizarre because as you're revealing these records, you may find something anomalous here, something incriminating, something strange that you would want to have investigated. But they were absolutely prohibited from doing that, and the Board of Trustees of the ARRB strictly enforced that. They made it clear that if any staff member was caught investigating the Kennedy assassination in any aspect or any of these documents that were being released, that they were subject to being terminated. So there were a lot of strange things as Horn. Now remember, Doug Horn, the guy that I mentioned that wrote Inside the Assassination Records Review Board, he served on the staff. And so they were coming up with things that were quite unusual, like 2 brain examinations when the military pathologist had said that there was only 1 brain examination. So clearly they're committing perjury here when they're caught, and there's 2 brain examinations, the second of which could not possibly have been John Kennedy's brain. And so this is something you would want investigated. But the law said no. But at the very least, though, they released thousands and thousands of documents that were able to, especially in the area of the autopsy, but other things as well, that were pointing in the direction of criminality. The law gave them, at the discretion of the ARRB, the Board of Trustees, another 25 years to keep certain records secret that they felt threatened national security or some kind of nonsense like that. So there were thousands and thousands of records that were put into that category, a 25-year extension of time. And that time came due under Trump's administration the first time. Trump vowed to release those and violated that vow. He got visited by the CIA, and the next day, or a couple of days later or something, he says, no, I'm going to extend the time for secrecy. And so that extended the time into Biden's administration, and then Biden says, well, I'm going to extend the time for secrecy again. And by the time Biden left, it was pretty clear that the CIA, the Pentagon, they were going to have secrecy into perpetuity. Now, let me emphasize that these records that we're talking about, James, were put into the National Archives. And so it was really the National Archives that's maintaining the secrecy at the request of these agencies. But these are not documents that are now coming out of the CIA. They're documents that have been in the possession of the National Archives. The reason that's important is that the mainstream press is now reporting, oh, well, there's no smoking guns. There's no confession here. Well, there was never going to be a smoking gun or a confession because there was no possibility that they would turn over the National Archives, even 25 years previous, that, oh, we confessed to having killed Kennedy. So there was never a possibility of that.
Please kill JFK, signed LBJ.
Exactly. That's why it's so ludicrous when I see this, oh, there's no smoking gun here. The real significance to me of these records is why they want to keep them secret. Because they kept saying this is a threat to national security. Well, now they've released about 80% of them, as I understand it. The United States is still standing. The communists have not taken over the United States. Cuba hasn't invaded. The Soviet Union is gone. So where was the whole national security threat? So they've got to have been hiding these records for a reason. And what I've always argued is there's small, tiny nuggets there that fill in the overall mosaic of what happened here. And that's why they were trying to keep them secret.
This is the thing, yes. Looking for the smoking gun in these records is ridiculous. But there can be things that are approached from some sort of tangential angle that even the people releasing the documents don't quite understand what they're releasing. And the example that I would use for that, back during the ARRB and the documents they were releasing, that included the release of the Operation Northwoods documents, which are bread and butter conspiracy lore for people like myself who've been researching this for decades now in the circles of false flag terrorism. Well, here was the plan to stage terror attacks, blame them on Cuba as a pretext for justifying invading Cuba, that was released as part of the ARRB, that was set up as a result of the JFK Records Act, which was passed as a result of the JFK film. So in a way, Oliver Stone's film led to the release of this incredibly vitally important document for understanding U.S. military history that, again, the person releasing that probably didn't even understand the significance of the document they were releasing. And that's what I would expect is the type of thing we're going to be finding from these records. But for your own personal research interests, for example, you're interested in the autopsy. I know you've written about the Zapruder film and the bizarre, zany things that happened to that in the days and weeks after, and months and years after the assassination. What types of records do you think might be interesting to look at in this new tranche of release?
Well, I think one aspect of it, and they still haven't all been released, so we still don't know what's to come out, but I've always felt and suspected that there's some records there relating to the Mexico City part of this operation. Mexico City was a disaster for them. That Oswald goes down to Mexico City and has this big hubbub at the Cuban embassy and the Soviet embassy, makes a scene, screams at them, supposedly meets with the head of assassinations for the Soviet Union there. It's all has the appearance of a staged thing because the national security establishment was saying, oh, well, this had to be an assassination by the Soviet Union or Cuba. Well, if that's the case, would they really want an assassin making all this hubbub there at the embassies? I mean, it's ridiculous. And so after the assassination, they started to investigate Mexico City. Some people did. And immediately that got shut down. As soon as Oswald's killed, the whole Mexico City thing is still pretty much shrouded in secrecy. And so my hunch is that there might be some records there that fill out some of the shenanigans that were going on with Mexico City. There's a document that has come out. It had come out previously, but it had in redacted form by Arthur Schlesinger. And Schlesinger was an assistant to the president, court historian. And this memo that they've now released unredacted shows that Schlesinger was telling Kennedy that the CIA needed to be reformed in a very massive way. And so this is one of those small pieces of information that fills in the mosaic because the idea is that Kennedy was at war with the national security establishment. The war starts with the Bay of Pigs, where Kennedy is furious after that. He had gotten double-crossed by the CIA. He realized that they were playing him, and he took responsibility, but it was clearly the CIA that had misled him as to the prospects for success. So Kennedy supposedly vowed, the words are, to tear the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. Well, that's the war that starts. So when you look at Operation Northwoods, that's part of that war. The Pentagon is saying you need to invade Cuba now. You failed at the Bay of Pigs, but this is a threat to national security. Kennedy says no. Here you've got this Schlesinger memo saying we've got to do something about the CIA, and here's what we're going to do. Well, this is all part of the war that was being waged between Kennedy and the national security branch of the government. And that's critical in terms of motive. They've never been able to come up with a motive for Oswald, but there is a lot of motive with respect to the national security establishment.
Yes, it certainly has been a feature of the assassination cover-up for many, many decades now that Oswald was just some sort of lone nut with no particular reason for killing Kennedy. Whereas in reality, yes, the national security establishment had many reasons why they might want to kill Kennedy, but did they actually do so, and what can we point to give evidence of that? Well, I think that is the task that we have before ourselves for today, and as I say, I don't think there's a smoking gun, but I think we can at least start to put some of the pieces on the table, and you heard Jacob Hornberger of the Future of Freedom Foundation, FFF.org. You heard him there reference and allude to a couple of the trails that one can find in these files. But let's start getting into it in more depth. And let's start examining some of the places where these types of files and are researched by researchers who know a thing or two about files like these. So let's start, for example, with the National Security Archive. I've told the story many times, but it was at the National Security Archive website, nsarchive.gwu.edu, that I first found the Operation Northwoods documents themselves. They have been preserved online there. And the National Security Archive, as you might imagine, you should probably know by now if you listen to me, does have many document releases of all sorts from many eras of the U.S. government specifically. And a lot of interesting information are stored in the vaults of this website. So what do the researchers at the National Security Archive, that is, what do they have to say about these JFK files? Well, they've obviously put out some work on that already. For example, JFK files, revelations from the Covert Operations High Command, in which they've assembled some PFIAB meeting minutes. That's the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board meeting minutes, which provide dramatic view of CIA operations. And it points out, for example, in Brazil, the CIA is carrying out covert action in the labor movement, and CIA believes the communist control can be weakened. In Cuba, the CIA was shifting from external raids to internal sabotage operations, running 10 black operations per month and targeting dissident Cuban elements. In British Guyana, the CIA secretly financed a 79-day general strike to destabilize the elected government, and they were doing that through the AFL-CIO. So, mafia ties? Huh? The CIA? Never. They've talked about documents relating to Cuba, British Guyana, Chile, Congo, Haiti, etc. And as always with National Security Archive posts, the actual documents themselves are itemized, titled, and conveniently available for download down at the bottom of the post. So I will throw this in for interested researchers. Also, they had this post up just several days ago. JFK papers reveal CIA family jewels spying operation in United States. And this article begins, both John F. Kennedy and his brother, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, were briefed by CIA officials on an agency counterintelligence operation to break into the French embassy in Washington for the removal of documents, according to formerly top-secret FBI reports declassified in full for the first time as part of the JFK Files release. And they talk more about that operation and Operation Woodor, and other such interesting parts of this, other covert operations, Israel, the UN, etc. The family jewels, what are those? What do they contain? And again, some more documents. So definitely the National Security Archive has been pouring through these documents, and it was in that context that a representative of the NSA, that's the National Security Archive, not the National Security Agency, talked to Amy Goodman of Democracy Now! About some of the things that we can garner from these JFK files that aren't necessarily about the JFK assassination itself, but still tell us something important about the nature of the black ops being conducted by the CIA in the 1960s.
So you write that on the day President Kennedy's inauguration in January 61, nearly half of the political officers serving in the U.S. embassies were CAS, intelligence officers working under diplomatic cover known as controlled American sources. What's the significance of this, Peter?
Well, simply the significance is that whereas most people thought these were actually State Department officials in U.S. embassies around the world, almost half the people in these embassies, particularly using the office that was called political officer, were CIA undercover agents. It's pretty incredible. As Arthur Schlesinger pointed out in this extraordinary memo that's been completely declassified now to John F. Kennedy on June 10th, 1961, 3,700 officers around the world were CIA officials under diplomatic cover, in comparison to 3,900 of actual diplomats around the world. So it was almost 50%, and that's quite an extraordinary number. And I think a number of countries will be surprised at the kind of level of to which the U.S. embassies were being used as cover for the CIA. Again, this is all in the past. It's old history. We've known for many years that political officers were often used to kind of disguise CIA operations. And there were other parts of the the embassies too, the labor attachés, the commercial attachés, et cetera. And then there were the CIA officers that were operating in countries like Chile and Bolivia and Brazil and elsewhere who weren't in the embassies at all. But it's a tidbit of covert operations history that certainly is dramatic and reminds us of what the United States was doing around the world and is capable of doing in the future.
All right, I realize that when people talk about the exciting and sexy release of classified files and other conspiratainment, they're probably not thinking about extra, the CIA did covert operations. I know that's not exactly the most incredible news that will thunderstrike my audience as absolute amazing information that needs to be spread, but it is important for actual serious researchers out there to have actual documentation of such things. As much as it was suspected, we can at least point to certain documents and have certain facts under our belt. So I would recommend that people at the very least take a look at the National Security Archive postings on the JFK files. I believe they're continuing to go through them. But, of course, that was NSA representative, National Security Archive representative Peter Kornblue on Democracy Now! And Democracy Now! Being Democracy Now!, you know that there has to be a bit of limited hangout whitewash going on. So I will exhort you to go and watch that full conversation where you see Amy Goodman, yes, even Amy Goodman, trying to press Peter on the issue of U.S. aid and the revelations about the covert operations that were being done by the CIA through U.S. aid back in that time frame, back in the 1960s, which, of course, Peter concedes and then says, but that was the old times in the past, and that has nothing to do with why U.S. aid should be dismantled now. No, U.S. aid is all about helping poor people and giving food to starving children, and dismantling it is a crime, I tell you. So there's a bit of that. But anyway, what would you expect from the establishment alternative media, shall we say? Anyway, having said that, let's keep going. There's plenty more documents and things to sink our teeth into, including some things actually related to JFK and the JFK assassination, believe it or not. And a good place to start for people who are just getting their bearings on this would be among the researchers who have literally dedicated decades upon decades of their lives to researching this information and can speak authoritatively on it, much more authoritatively than I can, let alone the average Joe Blow YouTuber who's trying to make a sensationalist, clickbaity kind of video. If you want sensationalist, clickbaity conspiratainment, there is no lack of that around this subject. You can just go type it into any of the, well, probably not YouTube, but probably any of the other video platforms, and you'll find plenty of it, just not here. So, again, please stop watching if that's what you're looking for. But if you're looking for real research, let's take a look at what the real researchers are saying, and I would hope that people in my audience are familiar with this resource, but if not, you will be soon. It's called JFK Facts, and it is a Substack blog that has compiled, it is essentially the work of a number of different researchers, one of whom is, and it was co-founded and is edited by Jefferson Morley. That is a name that people should know because, for example, he's been involved with the Mary Farrell Foundation, which has done a lot of this work of collecting JFK-related documents and disseminating information on the assassination over the years. For example, when I cite CIA document 1035-960 on the CIA implanting the term conspiracy theory into the popular lexicon, I generally link to the Mary Farrell Foundation link of that document. So I will do so again, just for your edification, in case you haven't seen that document. Anyway, as I say, you probably know, well, you should know Jefferson Morley as a longtime JFK researcher. He was a Washington Post reporter for decades and came to this story through that, but has been diligently researching it over the intervening decades and has established a community at jfkfacts.substack.com that pores over and has talked about and gone over many aspects of the JFK case, as you might imagine. Here on their page, on their About page, why subscribe to JFK Facts? To get cutting-edge journalism about causes of JFK assassination, to support a publication dedicated to abolishing the official secrecy that still surrounds the records, to promote a trusted news source whose JFK reporting has been picked up by the MSM. kind of undermines their claim there, and to receive the latest information about the ongoing declassification of JFK records. Well, speaking of which, they have, as you might imagine, a lot to say about the JFK files. For example, there was this post up recently on the world exclusive, the CIA's pre-assassination file on Lee Harvey Oswald. The CIA has claimed at various times, in fact, most of the time over the past preceding 6 decades, that the CIA had nothing to do with Oswald and didn't know anything about him. He was complete. Well, that's obviously a lie. Specifically, they very much lied under oath, for example, to the House Select Committee, telling them that they had minimal information on Oswald. By minimal, they meant nearly 200 pages of documents. So there is this pre-assassination Oswald CIA file that JFK Facts has compiled and is available for download from their website that has all of the documents that, at least so far, have been released pertaining to what the CIA knew about Oswald before the assassination. Obviously, this isn't everything they knew, but this is what has been released so far. And even in and of itself, it's pretty damning. It certainly paints the picture that this was not just some random guy who just happened to do... No, this was someone that they very much knew about beforehand. So this document is definitely for researchers and specifically for myself, who I think Oswald is in many ways the key to the story, not because Oswald did it, but because Oswald's story is so outrageous that I think we have to understand, once examining that story critically, that it cannot possibly be the case that this was a lone nut. Anyway, this is a good document to help you along with that. The download here at JFK Facts. You will have to be a signed-in member of JFK Facts in order to get that document. But anyway, it is there for your perusal and pleasure. They're continuing to plow through the documents. They have this post up, for example, from the new JFK files, Anatomy of the CIA's Expensive Failure in Cuba. A declassified memo reveals the price tag for a losing war, $270 million in today's dollars. So this is referring to a 29-page memorandum that was just released as part of this document dump. And they go through it and tally up the total of all of the money spent and come to the inflation-adjusted number of $270 million. Again, lots of information here about the operations that were going on against Cuba that obviously are highly relevant in the JFK story, the assassination, as well as just the JFK presidency. But perhaps for today's purposes, this might be the most on the point of what we're looking at today. From the new JFK files, how a top CIA officer lied about the surveillance of Oswald. Specifically talking about CIA counterintelligence chief James Angleton, who that name should be familiar to you if you know anything at all about the assassination or CIA operations generally during that time. But if you do not, well, don't worry. This article will bring you up to speed about Angleton and about what the CIA has said in the past. Specifically, they hone in on this revelation from the recently released documents. They talk about an earlier released January 1958 memo in which Angleton admitted that the sole purpose of intercepting reading people's mail coverage in the cryptonym speak of the CIA gaggle, he said, was to identify persons behind the Iron Curtain who might have some ties in the U.S. and who could be approached in their countries as contacts and sources for CIA. Okay, makes sense. They were intercepting mail of potential sources, CIA sources, living behind the Iron Curtain. Well, like who? Well, like Oswald, of course. So, 22 months later, in November 1959, Angleton ordered up mail coverage on an utterly ordinary young soldier named Lee Harvey Oswald. Yes, indeed. He was interested in a man often described as a pathetic and sociopathic loser. Just a lone nut, I tells you. Anyway, there's lots more information that is in this document and about Angleton and his various connections, which we will start talking about later. But why don't we turn to Jefferson Morley himself describing the significance of this particular find in the JFK files and why it has, at least for Jefferson Morley, thoroughly convinced him that we can now say, without a doubt, the CIA was culpable, either through malfeasance or misfeasance, at any rate, is culpable in the death of JFK. And we get this from the testimony that Jefferson Morley was giving, along with such people as Oliver Stone, at the recent declassification hearings of the House Oversight Committee that is looking at the JFK files. So let's take it from Jefferson Morley's testimony to that committee.
In the spring of 2023, the CIA fully declassified for the first time its pre-assassination file on Lee Harvey Oswald, the accused assassin who denied killing the president and was killed himself in police custody before he could defend himself. I have a copy here of the CIA's pre-assassination file on Lee Harvey Oswald, and I'm submitting it for the record. The declassified Oswald file runs to, and fact checkers can confirm this, 198 pages. In the fall of 1963, in November of 1963, this file was held in the office of James Angleton, counterintelligence chief at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, not 5 miles from the White House where President Kennedy lived and worked. To be sure, the declassified Oswald file is not a smoking gun. I showed it to journalists whose judgment I trust, and they shrugged. They said this is evidence of incompetence. CYA, they said, cover your ass. I didn't quite believe that, but I couldn't prove them wrong until March 18th. That was the day that the National Archives began posting long secret JFK assassination records that had been withheld from public view for decades. I started by looking at 9 declassified documents about Mr. Angleton. He was the man who compiled the Oswald file. And when I came to a long secret transcript of Angleton's testimony to the House Select Committee on Assassinations in 1978, my reservations about passing judgment on the responsibility vanished. One newly declassified passage showed that Angleton had lied under oath about his surveillance of Oswald's correspondence while he lived in the Soviet Union from 1959 to 1962. And that, for me, was a tipping point. The transcript, which the CIA withheld from public view for half a century, confirmed a disturbing fact. James Angleton is the 3rd senior CIA officer known to have lied under oath about what they knew about the alleged assassin Oswald before JFK was killed. The first was Deputy Director Richard Helms. He lied to the Warren Commission in May 1964 when he said under oath the CIA had only, quote, minimal information about Oswald before JFK was killed. 198 pages of information cannot be truthfully described as minimal. The second CIA officer who lied was George Joannides, chief of the Covert Action Branch of the Miami Station in 1963. His agents in the top-secret AMSPEL program generated propaganda about Oswald's pro-Castro activities both before and after the president was killed. 15 years later, in 1978, the CIA inserted Joannides into the House JFK investigation, and he blocked any investigation of contacts between Oswald and his AMSPEL agents. Obstructing Congress cannot be considered evidence of incompetence. And this is what I believe in summary. One false statement might be incompetence. A second false statement might be CYA for the first false statement. But 3 false statements by top CIA officers about Kennedy's accused killer, that is a pattern. It's a pattern of misconduct. It's a pattern of malfeasance. If 3 police officers lie about their knowledge of a homicide defendant, that cannot be considered exculpatory evidence. To the contrary, it shows guilty knowledge and criminal culpability. It is, in a word, incriminating. The new fact pattern leads to a new conclusion. We know now what they knew about Oswald and when they knew it. We know now that Richard Helms, James Angleton, and George Joannides were responsible for or complicit in the death of the president, either by criminal negligence or covert action. My recommendations to the task force are 1, secure and release the personnel file of George Joannides, and 2, ask the CIA to provide a public statement answering the question, why did these 3 men lie to JFK investigators? The answers will help fulfill the task force goal, the president's goal, and the people's goal of full and complete JFK disclosure. Thank you.
That was Jefferson Morley of JFK Facts testifying to the House Oversight Committee on the release of these documents and what needs to come next. I would encourage you to watch the rest of that presentation. Again, Oliver Stone and others making their own presentations to that committee. But I think that Jefferson Morley raises some interesting points there that at the very least should convince people, the people who have been hanging on for the past 60 years about the whether or not to believe there may be something fishy here. Yes, maybe it is time to admit that 3 CIA officers lying under oath about what they knew regarding Oswald might be enough to justify, for example, thinking about whether that is actually exculpatory or whether that actually makes the CIA complicit in what happened in the crime itself. Well, we could continue along those lines and we could dig up other files individually. And at this point, I will, of course, once again exhort the Corbett Report community, those interested members, please engage in the process. Start looking through files, coming up with your own research. I definitely want to hear about it. Please do leave it in the comment section of this podcast. But let's start taking a look at some other interesting pieces of information that have come out that, again, may have something to do with the larger puzzle that's being constructed here. For example, this particular release, JFK Assassination System Identification Form, this is the 176-10030-10422. The title of this is Memo to President, CIA Reorganization. And when you scroll down on it, it is a faithful reproduction, a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy of a letter that was written, well, presumably on the subject of CIA reorganization. What on earth is this document about? It is legible, but it does take a little bit of parsing because the copy of a copy of a copy effect has made it difficult to read over the years. But if you want more information about the context of this memo and what it is and who's writing it to whom and on what grounds, I would exhort you to look at this by Chad Nagel, again posted to JFK Facts just a few weeks ago, released in full, JFK's CIA reorganization that never was, which talks about a 1961 memo on CIA fully released on Trump's order, reveals proposals for reining in the agency's power and privilege. And Chad Nagel begins by noting that with the release of 63,400 pages of assassination-related files this past March, comes a long-awaited White House memo on reorganizing the CIA. A page and a half of this document, presented to Kennedy in June 61, had remained fully redacted until 3 days ago, well, until last month. It illuminates the origins of policy tension between Kennedy and the CIA that would last the rest of his administration. And it notes that the reason many have suspected the CIA in the crime of November 22nd, 1963, is that the agency found itself at cross purposes with the foreign policy goals of the liberal president. After the failed CIA-led invasion of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs on April 13th, 1961, JFK felt the agency had tricked him, and he never forgot it. He is widely quoted as saying he wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. Hopefully you have heard that quotation before. I've made reference to it before and had cause to note that it certainly was part of the process that seemed to be going on at the time of Kennedy's administration of, well, if not dismantling the CIA, at least taking steps to neuter it in various ways, including getting rid of Allen Dulles as the head of the CIA under Kennedy's tenure, which was clearly a shot across the bow to the intelligence community generally. And who ends up on the Warren Commission as the CIA liaison to that commission? Of course, Allen Dulles. So Allen Dulles tells us the magic bullet theory as endorsed by the CIA for the CIA. Well, nothing to see here, folks. Well, let's take a look at this document in particular. So after the Bay of Pigs, JFK commissioned an aide, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., to analyze the structure and operations of the CIA and report back with his opinions. The result, a 15-page memorandum for the president with CIA reorganization in the subject line and dated June 30th, 1961. It discusses a range of issues connected with perceived dysfunctions in the powerful clandestine agency dating back to its formation in 1947. And as Chad Nagel goes on to note, this is the document that was released in full for the first time just last month. It was part of the JFK Most Wanted list compiled by JFK Facts in anticipation of this release as, well, hey, there's this 1.5-page redaction in this memo. Maybe we'd like to see that. Well, we can now see the entire document. Again, you can download it for yourself. I'll include the link so that you can go directly there. But getting to the meat and potatoes, it does include, for example, an observation that under the British system, clandestine collection is entrusted to the Secret Intelligence Service, whereas the research, analysis, and estimating function is located in the Foreign Office Research Department, which may be a subtle point for those not interested in how any of this works. But the point, of course, is to separate intelligence collection and clandestine operations from research and analysis, because if you combine the two, as was combined in the CIA when it was founded, you start to get the problem of, for example, intelligence. If intelligence is too closely connected with operations, then those committed to a particular operation will tend to select out the intelligence which validates the operation. Right? So I think we can all understand how that works. And if not, well, we can look at past examples of, Saddam, definitely, and his weapons of mass destruction. How was that perception of the Iraqi threat before the Iraq War? How was that put together? Well, it was put together by cherry-picking intelligence. And we now know some degree of detail about how that was actually done. If you want to know more about that, you can see my 5.5-hour documentary on Al-Qaeda, the false flags, the secret history of Al-Qaeda, where I detail, for example, the secret offices in the Pentagon that were essentially cherry-picking information for the intelligence community to put their finger at Saddam. It was Saddam, I tell you. He's got these weapons of mass destruction. Anyway, so then this memo is about the the reorganization of the CIA that JFK wanted to establish. So it's very interesting that this is coming out now. And the latest revelation, well, I'll let you read about that in this particular report. I think there's some interesting nuggets in there. And obviously, of course, the CIA reorganization as envisaged in that 1961 memo, let alone in JFK's infamous quotation about splintering the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scattering it to the winds, didn't actually happen because, well, something happened in Dallas, Texas in November 1963 instead. So if we want to talk about people with real motivation for killing the president, that might enter into the conversation. Again, there are lots of little things like this that most average people would have no idea that this document even exists, or the background to it, or how it connects into the bigger story, but that, well, there are a number of researchers that are going through and picking out these threads right now, and I think they're important. But perhaps even more important, there are still to this day, there are still documents that have not been released in their entirety. And why not? And what are those documents? And what information might they contain? Well, one example of that, The Hill were recently reporting crucial JFK information still unreleased, according to author James H. Johnston. A missing memorandum documenting a conversation between former President Lyndon B. Johnson and ex-CIA Director John McCone days after President Kennedy's assassination could contain crucial information that was never submitted to the National Archives. John McCone always wrote a memorandum for the record of any conversation he had with the president, Johnston was explaining to The Hill, and that memorandum was not given over to the National Archives and is not available. And so, according to Johnston, State Department historians viewed the document in 1997 and noted the conversation included discussion about Cuba and, quote, how they were going to get rid of Castro, end quote. The full contents of this conversation remain unknown to the public. So this document exists. We know it exists. We know that certain people have seen it and talked about what it contains, but we still have not seen that document because it was never handed over to the National Archives. Because, as we were talking about before, the ARRB and its scope of conduct was about determining what are assassination-related records and what aren't. And anything that was deemed not an assassination-related record was never turned over to them. So those are the documents that we're starting to see now, 25 plus years later, 30 years later, after the ARRB had wrapped up what it was doing. But anything that was not submitted to the National Archives obviously wouldn't be in there in the first place, like, for example, that missing memorandum. So there are certainly still gaps in our knowledge, obviously, of course. As I would expect many of my audience might suspect, anything of true, absolute smoking gun relevance would either have been long destroyed, would never have existed in the first place or would never have been submitted to the ARRB. So, yes, by all means, please do point out that there are documents that we will never see as a part of this release or any other release, likely, that are still out there. And some of them that we can put our fingers on and say that document that we know exists, we still have not seen. And of course, who knows how many others that we can't say because we don't know about. But if you want more on the question of John McCone, this isn't exactly conspiracy fringe stuff. I mean, even Politico back in 2015 was reporting through Philip Shannon. Yes, the CIA director was part of the JFK assassination cover-up, in which he was noting a CIA historian, David Robarge, who had written a report talking about how McCone, who died in 1991, was the heart of a benign cover-up at the spy agency, intended to keep the commission focused on what the agency believed at the time was the best truth, that Lee Harvey Oswald, for as yet undetermined motives, had acted alone in killing John Kennedy. The most important information that McCone withheld from the commission in its 1964 investigation, the report found, was the existence for years of CIA plots to assassinate Castro, some of which put the CIA in cahoots with the mafia. Without this information, the commission never even knew to ask the question of whether Oswald had accomplices in Cuba or elsewhere who wanted Kennedy dead in retaliation for the Castro plots. Well, make of that what you will, but at any rate, there are some incredibly important pieces of the story that were not even, again, the Warren Commission didn't even know to ask because they had never been told about this important information because it was actively covered up by the agency and not only John McCone, but of course the agency's man on the Warren Commission itself, Alan Dulles. So this has been a known problem for some time and only compounds with what Jefferson Morley is talking about with the 3 CIA operatives that we know lied under oath about what they knew about Oswald pre-assassination. So again, there's an obvious pattern here, and you'd have to be willfully, gleefully blind not to see it and not to question it and not to think that there's anything worth considering in any of this. But you know what? There are still people who are actually arguing that. So perhaps, maybe the most interesting thing to come out of this whole JFK files release, at least in 2025, is the people who are curiously incurious about what these files may or may not contain.
Now, Douglas, you're not a conspiracy theorist at all. It seems when it comes to the JFK assassination and the recently released CIA files, all 63,000 pages of documents, have not persuaded you otherwise.
Well, first of all, no, I'm not a conspiracy theorist in general. Although, as I say in the column, I mean, we do live in an era of conspiracy thinking. For sure, which the internet, multimedia, and much more of just social media have managed to metastasize as a tendency. But as I say in the column, one of the problems about conspiracy theories in our own day, as always, is that some things get called conspiracy theories that actually turn out to be what we used to call true. And that's definitely something that people notice. But no, when it comes to the JFK assassination, I've always thought this is one of those cases like the death of Princess Diana, where you get a whole industry of people who essentially can't cope with or don't want to cope with the randomness of life and the precariousness of life, even of the world's most famous people. And come up with very elaborate and interesting theories about what has happened. And with the JFK files, we've been told for years that there would be stuff that had been held back and that it would be a real zinger when we learned about it. And since President Trump's order to release the remaining files on the assassination of President Kennedy, we now know almost exactly what the Dallas police knew within a few hours of the shooting 50 years ago. And that's already disappointing some people. And as I say in the piece, you can never kill conspiracy theories because they are by nature self-reinforcing. If the evidence isn't there, it means that there is evidence that's being kept from you still.
So Ben Shapiro's at it again. With his eyebrows?
He says, "Why does it matter who killed an American president?" That's his. He wrote this article, and it's titled "Ben Shapiro says Why does it matter who shot JFK?"
Do you have the bits for it?
Yeah. Well, if it doesn't matter who shot JFK, why not declassify all the documents then?
Yeah, not the crap ones they put out. They're real ones.
Am I right?
Yes.
I don't know why it matters. I'd like to know. They're hiding it from us, Ben.
That's right.
Why does something have to be sealed for 75 years?
If it didn't matter, they wouldn't be hiding the evidence. So that's the evidence for why it matters right there, that they're hiding the evidence.
Why do you look like that chick that got fired from the Daily Wire, and I think you are her? I think he is Brett Cooper.
Does he look like his soul is drained out of his body? Because that's what it looks like to me, that picture. It looks like it, like he knows what an uphill battle he has because everything he says is a lie, and now everyone knows it. I could just hear his Mossad handler talking to him. Okay, Ben, here's your assignment. You have to tell everyone that it doesn't matter who shot JFK, and then somehow magically get them to not immediately put together that it was Israel. You can do it.
I didn't think it was Israel until he said all this shit.
That's right.
Yeah, there are no doubt a number of off-the-wall, zany, weird, hot takes that are being spit out over the JFK files, but you have to think that in 2025, the crazy conspiracy theorists who think that there's something there take is probably the hottest and spiciest of them all at this point. And yeah, Ben Shapiro's "Does it really matter who shot JFK?" That, I don't know about you guys, but that gives me serious Chomsky vibes.
I mean, it just doesn't make any. I mean, even if we're true, which is extremely unlikely, who cares? You know? I mean, it doesn't have any significance.
Yeah, 9/11, who cares? And JFK, that's old news. Nothing to see here, guys. Yeah, interesting, suspicious, almost as if these people have some sort of interest in this information not coming to light. But the question would be, what kind of interest do they have in this information not coming to light? Ben Shapiro? This font of truth? Facts don't care about your feelings, Mr. Shapiro. Douglas Murray? Where has he ever led us astray? Well, the question might be, what are their shared interests? Well, I don't know if you know this. Most people don't, because he keeps it very secret. Ben Shapiro is something of an ardent Zionist who will defend absolutely anything that Israel ever does. And Douglas Murray, that's right. Israel honors British journalist Douglas Murray for support post-October 7th. And if you haven't seen his debate, if you can call it that, with Dave Smith on the Joe Rogan Experience just in the past week, well, you're missing out. It's interesting how, well, I would say Douglas Murray is performing a controlled demolition of his own career by taking the stance that he is. But at any rate, you come to your own conclusions on all of that. But it just seems that they may have some sort of interest in not seeing certain JFK files come to light. Well, if you want more information on that, you can go to Mint Press News, where Robert Inlakesh penned an article on why Ben Shapiro and pro-Israel pundits are melting down over the JFK files, in which he notes, as a result of this release, you start getting things like Ben Shapiro's now infamous, "Why does it actually matter who shot JFK?" op-ed. Talk about a hot take. And Inlakesh goes on to talk about some of the concerning facts for people like Shapiro. For example, he writes, "Theories alleging Israeli involvement in Kennedy's assassination are not new, but have gained traction in recent years. In 2004, Israeli nuclear whistleblower Mordecai Vanunu, who served 18 years in prison for exposing Israel's secret weapons program, publicly endorsed the theory. 4 years later, in 2008, Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi drew international attention to the theory, amplifying its reach even further. A 2016 release from the National Security Archive revealed that Kennedy had expressed deep concerns about Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion's efforts to acquire nuclear weapons. The U.S. president suspected that Israel's refusal to allow inspections at the Dimona nuclear facility was a smokescreen designed to conceal a covert weapons program, an issue that has gained legitimacy since the latest document release." And it goes on. In 2023, further revelations suggested Kennedy had attempted to send Nobel Prize-winning physicist Isidore Rabi to inspect the reactor at Dimona. Communications indicate that the trip was to be facilitated through U.S. Department legal advisor Abram Chase and his Israeli counterpart Teddy Kollek. The initiative was ultimately blocked by the Israeli side. Perhaps even more telling is Kennedy's order to the U.S. Department of Justice to force the American Zionist Council, AZC, the forerunner to AIPAC, to register under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, FARA. The AZC was directly funded by the Israeli government, and Kennedy's insistence on transparency alarmed Israeli officials. All right, it's a lengthy article. Obviously, the link will be in the show notes if you guys want to go through it for yourselves. But yes, there may be some concerning pieces of information for staunch supporters of Israel in the Kennedy files, even if it doesn't necessarily directly relate to the assassination itself, which there are certain reasons to believe that it might. But even if it didn't, certain points about, for example, the Israeli illegal and to this day officially denied nuclear stockpile might be little pieces of information that might make it difficult for the pro-Israel side to do their usual defense. Well, anyway, there are documented and documentable and on the record facts that one can draw out of this. For example, yes, it is true. Robert Kennedy's attempt to register AIPAC as a foreign agent. This was a presentation that Grant F. Smith, who has appeared on the Corbett Report in the past, that he gave several years ago for the Washington Report on Middle East Affairs. So you can watch that and see the actual documentation on that. You can look at other pieces of this puzzle, like Jack Ruby. Jack Ruby, the mobster who, of course, gunned down Oswald in plain sight, in police custody, no less. Nothing to see here, guys. Jack Ruby, he sounds like probably Italian. I mean, he's mafia, right? He's a mobster, so he must be... Oh, wait, it's not Jack Ruby. Of course, it's Jacob Rubenstein, literally, is his real name. And yes, as you might get the inkling from that. Yes, of course, Jack Ruby was indeed heavily involved with the Jewish cause, with Israel itself, with Zionism, with the Jewish mafia that clearly existed and did operate in the U.S. And in fact, he did go on the record to say, as is documented in the Jewish Forward, for example, forward.com and other publications, he did say that he had done it, as in killed Oswald, quote, for the Jewish people. So make of that what you want. Anyway, it keeps going on. Remember, I alluded to the producer of JFK, the movie, Oliver Stone's movie earlier. Yes, Arnon Milchan, for those not in the know. You can look up Arnon Milchan and the very many number of films that he has produced. Pretty Woman and Fight Club and JFK and other such incredible... but what was it that happened there? Oh, yeah, right. The Times of Israel, 2013. Hollywood producer Aaron Milchan reveals past as... secret agent. Yes, literally. This Hollywood producer in charge of all these productions literally was part of an Israeli spying program that existed. And again, you should probably be in a position to know about it if you followed the Corbett Report. For example, episode 337, The Real Middle East Nuclear Threat, where I did play a portion of my interview with Grant F. Smith, in which he mentioned Milchan in particular. Talking about Milko and the Krytons that were being smuggled out of the U.S. as part of the nuclear smuggling ring that got Israel its illegal nuclear stockpile. It turns out Aaron Milchan was the person who was identified as the ringleader of that particular smuggling ring. And Benjamin Netanyahu was, of course, also involved in it. Yes, illegally smuggling parts for the nuclear program back in the 1960s. Back long before he became part of the... Israeli government itself. So anyway, that whole story is documented on my site. So it goes crazier and crazier. And oh yeah, you remember also that when I was talking about the documents that came out and Jefferson Morley was talking about with regards, for example, to James Angleton and his on-the-record lies about what the CIA knew about Oswald pre-assassination. Well, there's more to it than just that. For example, as Morley does point out, for example, at JFK Facts, Angleton built an Israeli intelligence network. Talking about the second important newly released JFK document from the files is the transcript of Angleton's closed-door testimony to Senate investigators in June 1975. It lays bare how he built his intelligence empire by incorporating Israeli agents into his collection network. And this goes on in quotes from the document itself and talks about his open admission of his back channels to Tel Aviv and using Israeli agents and defectors, of course, from the Soviet bloc, etc., as part of his collection efforts. And as it turns out, the person that he put on mail coverage, that is mail interception, literally reading Oswald's mail pre-assassination, was a man named Reuben Efron. And when you look into it, Reuben Efron, yeah, of course, was born in Lithuania. Efron worked as a lawyer in the capital Vilnius until immigrating to Cuba in 1939, according to Israeli Times. His mother was murdered in the Holocaust. Efron joined the U.S. Air Force in 1943 as an interpreter and rose to become a lieutenant colonel. By 1954, he was an operations officer in the Soviet Russia division of the CIA. But as it turns out, after leaving the CIA, he ultimately defected he went to Israel, where he became a scholar of spies in Jewish tradition. According to the Times of Israel, relatives interviewed by the Jewish Telegraph Agency say that they knew he had been working for the CIA in Washington. Family history said he had worked for the Pentagon. Later in life, he returned to the U.S. and settled in Miami until his death. And again, these are all documented and documentable facts, and I, of course, will throw in the links to all of these various things so you can go and explore them in your own time. The real question is, what do you do with these facts? How do these facts line up? What do they mean? Why might people like Ben Shapiro and Douglas Murray and others be so interested in getting you not to look at the JFK files? What is the real smoking gun here, if there is one? Or are these unconnected and disconnectable facts? Well, Let's get some opinions on that. For example, this is, for what it's worth, what Jefferson Morley has to say about this issue.
That explains the conspiracy theories, I guess. But I don't. What is it? Why would the links between Angleton and Israel be in
because Angleton was so close to them. I mean, and they were so close to him. Meir Amit was the head of Mossad from 1963 to 1970, something like that. A big intelligence baron of Israel. And Meir Amit said, when it came to U.S. officials, Angleton was the biggest Zionist of the lot. So Angleton is self-identified as a Zionist agent, and what we learned was
wait. When you say Zionist agent, you mean he was an agent who was a Zionist, not who was pro-Israel,
right? But what we see in the declassified is just how tightly it was. Angleton's asked, is there any conflict of interest?
You're not suggesting he's an Israeli agent?
Yes.
Right.
Angleton's asked, is there any conflict of interest between Israel and the United States? And he says no. So Angleton sees the Israelis as an indispensable part of this intelligence relationship that he himself has forged. So he's forging that relationship with the Israelis at the same time that he has Oswald under surveillance. And what has jump-started the Mossad done it meme, which I don't buy, was the revelation of Reuben Efron's name. Because Reuben Efron was an emigre from the Soviet Union. He was Angleton's spy on Oswald. And he after he retired from the CIA, he moved to Israel. So there was a closer connection than we ever knew between Angleton's Israeli arrangements and the surveillance of Oswald. Does that indicate that Mossad was party to a plot to kill the president? I don't think so. It's not evidence. There's no evidence of that there. There's no evidence of conspiracy. So, that's wholly conjectural and driven by other, political agendas, anti-Semitic or anti-Israel or, I don't know.
Sure. It doesn't help that Jack Ruby's real name was Jacob Leon Rubenstein.
Well, as I say, that is what Jefferson Morley himself had to say about that particular issue, and take it or leave it for whatever it is or isn't worth to you. You are all independent critical thinkers who are capable of coming to your own conclusions about the evidence and the facts that are in front of you. So do so. And you don't need my permission to do so, but I will exhort you to do so anyway. For those who are interested in my own take on issues like these, I would say what I have said for a very, very long time about issues of importance, world historical importance, for example, like JFK, like 9/11, I think events like these do not happen because of one particular group with one particular interest and only that one particular interest. I think there are spectacular events that require not only the participation in the execution and the planning of such an event, but the cover-up of such an event, not just for a little while, but for decades and decades later. Those types of spectacular events do require a number of different players at the table for a number of different reasons. So personally, no, I don't think Israel did JFK is the right way of framing this information. Because I have noted, for example, the people who tend to make it into that type of slogan, Mossad pulled the trigger. For example, are the types of people who generally will try to play up factually incorrect, debunkable and debunked things like, for example, JFK was fighting the Fed, I tell you. He was going to do these silver certificates and he was getting rid of the federal... No, he was not. And I have debunked that nonsense before. I will once again throw in a link to my presentation that I made to the JFK Lancer conference several years ago, in which I thoroughly, top to bottom, absolutely debunked that nonsense. Not only was JFK not trying to fight the Fed and, he was killed by the bankers or anything like of that sort. In fact, it was quite the opposite. He was giving them the free rein to end the issuance of the silver certificates, etc. So, blah, blah, blah. Long story short, no, that is total nonsense. And the people who are pumping it are either ill-informed or misinforming you. Also, I think that the people who say it was all Israel and only Israel matters in any of this are the types of people who will downplay absolutely every other player at the table and every other conceivable motive. Where there is no doubt that the intelligence apparatus of the United States, the national security apparatus of the United States, the military of the United States, and all of the people occupying those positions of power at the tops of those organizations had ample reason to be very, very angry at John F. Kennedy and to want him out of the way. I have, of course, detailed and talked about this many times in the past. Once again, I will refer you to my JFK to Gladio presentation, where I talked about the military operations and the people that Lemnitzer and others who had reason to hate the guts of JFK. Of course, I've alluded to Alan Dulles, who, of course, was forced out as director of CIA by JFK, and his vow to break the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter them to the winds. Others have talked at great length and in great detail about, for example, the plans to withdraw from Vietnam that were underway under Kennedy and that were changed. I will throw in a link to a good documentary about Fletcher Prouty and what he brought to the table in terms of what he knew about that. Of course, fictionalized as Mr. X in the JFK film. I will point you to other pieces of this puzzle. The fact that, for example, JFK absolutely came in as a screaming Cold Warrior, chest-beating military-industrial stooge who, at the very least, fell for the missile gap nonsense and campaigned on it in his run against Nixon in 1960, etc., but very quickly learned that he had been deceived about that, learned, for example, that the Bay of Pigs was a big trick that was being played on him, that there were operations afoot that he had no say over, didn't even know about, let alone. So he was obviously at war, in a sense, with the deep state, which, for example, played out during the Cuban Missile Crisis, with JFK having to establish his own secret relations to the Kremlin in order to go around the generals, etc., who he was aware were not going to want to resolve that conflict peacefully, etc., etc. There's a lot of different pieces of information in this stew, and we get glimpses and bits of it from documents like these. If you're looking for the smoking gun, go look to some conspiratainment podcast that's going to feed you some sensational lie that'll sound good and make a nice soundbite. But that's not what real research is. Real research is compiling bits of evidence that are out there and filling it in with other things that we can connect the dots with. And that's a painful and laborious process. So unfortunately, I don't have the short fix for that, but I do know that there are now thousands and thousands of documents that are out there that were not out there, at least in complete form, before. And that's something. That's something, isn't it? So, once again, I will say this is a work in progress. There is going to be more information coming to light. In fact, even on issues like this one. I will note that the JFK Facts, for example, is going to be publishing some sort of article in the near future about let me read this directly from the article. More on JFK files and Israeli nukes. JFK Facts will soon publish another story by reporters Peter Voskamp and Chad Nagel, drawn from the new JFK files about JFK, the CIA, and the Israeli nuclear program. Stay tuned. So there is more information that will be coming out about this. But as always, you can be part of this. This is not just a receptive, passive process where you're just watching a program. You can actually be part of this process of digging through this information. So for any would-be researchers in the crowd who are interested, once again, the JFK files are there. I will even provide the link for you. If you can't find the link, then maybe you're not very much of a researcher, but I will even provide the link in the show notes so that you can go there directly and start hunting your way through the files. And who knows what gems may be left there to uncover. Anyway, that is going to do it for our exploration today, but I want to thank you for investing your time in today's exploration and invite you, as always, the Corbett Report members, please leave your comments and your findings in the comment section for today's episode at CorbettReport.com. Having said all of that, again, thank you for investing your time. I'm James Corbett of CorbettReport.com. This is Assistant Sean in the background, and we will be back in the near future.
The Deep State. False Flags. 9/11 Truth. The Federal Reserve. Secret Wars and Hidden Histories. Fake News. Medical Martial Law. Ceaseless Propaganda. James Corbett. Reportage. Essays on the New World Order. Available where books are sold. Until they're not.
Reportagebook.com